We present the Reith Lectures, an annual series of broadcasts named in honor of the BBC's first Director General and instituted by the BBC as a stimulus to thought and a contribution to knowledge. The theme of this first series of 6 Reith Lectures is Authority and the Individual, and the speaker is the eminent philosopher Bertrand Russell. His opening lecture is entitled Social Cohesion and Human Nature. Here is Bertrand Russell.
The fundamental problem I propose to consider in these lectures is this: how can we combine that degree of individual initiative which is necessary for progress with the degree of social cohesion that is necessary for survival? I shall begin with the impulses in human nature that make social cooperation possible. I shall examine first the forms that these impulses took in very primitive communities, and then the adaptations that were brought about by the gradually changing social organizations of advancing civilization. I shall next consider the extent and intensity of social cohesion in various times and places, leading up to the communities of the present day and the possibilities of further development in the not very distant future. After this discussion of social cohesion, I shall take up the other side of the life of man in communities, namely individual initiative, showing the part that it has played in various phases of human evolution, the part that it plays at the present day, and the future possibilities of too much or too little initiative in individuals and groups. I shall then go on to one of the basic problems of our times, namely the conflict which modern technique has introduced between organization and human nature, or, to put the matter in another way, the divorce of the economic motive from the impulses of creation and possession. Having stated this problem, I shall examine what can be done towards its solution, and finally I shall consider as a matter of ethics the whole relation of individual thought and effort and imagination to the authority of the community. In all social animals, including man, the cooperation and the unity of a group has some foundation in instinct. This is most complete in ants and bees, which apparently are never tempted to antisocial actions and never deviate from devotion to the nest or the hive. Up to a point, we may admire this unswerving devotion to public duty, but it has its drawbacks. Ants and bees do not produce great works of art, or make scientific discoveries, or found religions teaching that all ants are sisters. Their social life, in fact, is mechanical, precise, and static. We are willing that human life shall have an element of turbulence, if thereby we can escape such evolutionary stagnation. Early man was a weak and rare species, whose survival at first was precarious. At some period, his ancestors came down from the trees and lost the advantage of prehensile toes, but gained the advantage of arms and hands. By these changes, they acquired the advantage of no longer having to live in forests, but on the other hand, the open spaces into which they spread provided a less abundant nourishment than they had enjoyed in the tropical jungles of Africa. Sir Arthur Keith estimates that primitive man required 2 square miles of territory per individual to supply him with food, and some other authorities place the amount of territory required even higher. Judging by the anthropoid apes and by the most primitive communities that have survived into modern times, early man must have lived in small groups, not very much larger than families, groups which, at a guess, we may put at, say, between 50 and 100 individuals. Within each group, there seems to have been a considerable amount of cooperation, but towards all other groups of the same species, there was hostility whenever contact occurred. So long as man remained rare, contact with other groups could be occasional, and at most times not very important. Each group had its own territory, and conflict would only occur at the frontiers. In those early times, marriage appears to have been confined to the group, so that there must have been a very great deal of inbreeding, and varieties, however originating, would tend to be perpetuated. If a group increased in numbers to the point where its existing territory was insufficient, it would be likely to come into conflict with some neighboring group, and in such conflict any biological advantage which one inbreeding group had acquired over the other might be expected to give it the victory, and therefore to perpetuate its beneficial variation. All this has been very convincingly set forth by Sir Arthur Keith. It is obvious that our early and barely human ancestors cannot have been acting on a thought-out and deliberate policy, but must have been prompted by an instinctive mechanism, the dual mechanism of friendship within the tribe and hostility to all others. As the primitive tribe was so small, each individual would know intimately each other individual, so that friendly feeling would be coextensive with acquaintanceship. The strongest and most instinctively compelling of social groups was, and still is, the family. The family is necessitated among human beings by the great length of infancy, and by the fact that the mother of young infants is seriously handicapped in the work of food gathering. It was this circumstance that with human beings, as with most species of birds, made the father an essential member of the family group. This must have led to a division of labor in which the men hunted while the women stayed at home. The transition from the family to the small tribe was presumably biologically connected with the fact that hunting could be more efficient if it was cooperative. And from a very early time, the cohesion of the tribe must have been increased and developed by conflicts with other tribes. The remains that have been discovered of early man and half-men are now sufficiently numerous to give a fairly clear picture of the stages in evolution from the most advanced anthropoid apes to the most primitive human beings. The earliest indubitably human remains that have been discovered so far are estimated to belong to a period about 1 million years ago. But for several million years before that time, there seem to have been anthropoids that lived on the ground and not in trees. The most distinctive feature by which the evolutionary status of these early ancestors is fixed is the size of the brain, which increased fairly rapidly until it reached about its present capacity, but has now been virtually stationary for hundreds of thousands of years. During these hundreds of thousands of years, man has improved in knowledge, in acquired skill, and in social organization, but not, so far as can be judged, in congenital intellectual capacity. That purely biological advance, so far as it can be estimated from bones, was completed a long time ago. It is to be supposed, accordingly, that our congenital mental equipment, as opposed to what we learn, is not so very different from that of Paleolithic man. We have still, it would seem, the instincts which led men, before their behavior had become deliberate, to live in a small tribe with a sharp antithesis of internal friendship and external hostility. The changes that have come since those early times have had to depend for their driving force partly upon this primitive basis of instinct and partly upon a sometimes barely conscious sense of collective self-interest. One of the things that cause stress and strain in human social life is that it is possible up to a point to become aware of rational grounds for a behavior not prompted by natural instinct. But when such behavior strains natural instinct too severely, nature takes her revenge by producing either listlessness or destructiveness, either of which may cause a structure imposed by reason to break down. Social cohesion, which started with loyalty to a group reinforced by the fear of enemies, grew by processes partly natural and partly deliberate, until it reached the vast conglomerations that we now know as nations. To these processes, various forces contributed. At a very early stage, loyalty to a group must have been reinforced by loyalty to a leader. In a large tribe, the chief or king may be known to everybody, even when private individuals are often strangers to each other.